Today, let's talk about improvisation. And to help me with that, I've got one of the best musicians in the business. His name is Rob Scheps. And we're going to discuss practicing and how to get started improvising on your instrument. This is part one of a two-part interview. Let's get started. Hi everybody, it's Harmonica Joe coming to you with my friend Rob Scheps. So we're sitting here in the woods in Pennsylvania, having a good time doing on a hike, talking about music things, and I thought, well, let's take the time and ask Rob a few questions. Now, Rob is a multi-instrumentalist, saxophone player, composer, all-around good guy. He works all over the country, based in New York as well as Portland, Oregon. Now, because Rob, he's not necessarily a harmonica player, but...
Not at all.
So you might wonder, well, what does that have to do with this channel? We play harmonica, but we're playing a musical instrument at the same time. By studying other instruments or how other musicians approach to playing their instruments besides a harmonica, as a harmonica player, we can learn a lot from that and hopefully add insight and make our playing and practice time a lot more efficient by learning how other people are doing it out there as well. So I thought it'd be fun today to talk with Rob about how he practices. We can talk about ideas that you use for transcriptions, as far as learning a solo, how much of a solo to learn. Sometimes we don't need to learn the whole thing, but the key sections that's going to apply to us in our playing. And talk a little bit about that and how he approaches, with his students, maybe as far as learning songs, transcribing, and how to be a better improviser.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot.
It is a lot.
You want to do one thing at a time?
Sure. Like a daily practice session. Let's just start with that. Like, what do you have your students do?
I kind of have a method, but I try to break it down so that I can give a student how to kind of practice everything they're working on in an hour. Because you kind of have to be realistic about people, their families, their day jobs, modern life, it's busy and people don't have a whole lot of time to shed sometimes. So you want to feel like, well, hey, if I only have 1 hour a day in between work and family or whatever, that you're kind of getting everything done, at least a little bit that you want to get done. Because I believe, let's say you're working on learning a little Walter tune and you're working on some major scales and you're working on some patterns. You don't want to work on one of those things for 5 days and then hit the other two. You want to hit all of them every day, even if you've only got 5 or 10 minutes for each item. I think that's more effective. I think if you have a little docket of 3 to 5 things that you're working on musically, and they could be unrelated, you just carve out a little time for each of them. So if you have an hour and you got 5 things, you can actually set an alarm on your phone or on an alarm clock, and then every 12 minutes you move on from one subject to the next, but at least then you're hitting every area where you're trying to improve each day. And I think that's the best way to get better.
That's it's kind of
not to leave days out of the things you're working on.
Yeah. Kind of like circuit training in a gym.
If you say so,
it's kind of the same thing, yeah.
Okay.
So I like that idea, setting a time. And then
so you can have a limited amount of time to practice. Okay, let's say it's Sunday afternoon and your whole family's gone. Your wife is out of town and you want to do a ton of shedding and you have more time than you will for the next week. But then you might do the same thing. You do the first hour where you hit everything a little bit, but then the other 2 hours would be a time to get a little deeper into some of those things, to have a more relaxed, extended time to really work something and get better and look a little deeper into it than you might on the days when you have less time to practice.
Let's take going back to the patterns and things. So if you're working on a solo, you've got 10 minutes. When you take a pattern, do you normally take it through the 12 keys? On a harmonica, that's a little more difficult than
Right.
it is on a saxophone or a trumpet.
Sure. F trumpet.
Or an F trumpet.
Inside joke. Anyway.
Do you take it like, say, the range of your instrument all the time, or do you just kind of work on one pattern and then move on and
why don't you,
into a
Joe?
solo?
Why don't you give me one example?
If I was working on, since we're talking about harmonica, majority of it is 12-bar blues playing.
Okay.
And we're playing, say, something in the style of Muddy Waters.
Love Muddy Waters.
If you're trying to come up with some solo ideas on your own to play in a variety of songs, would you take say, a 5-note pattern or a 6-note pattern, whatever it is that you come up with, and try to integrate that over the 3 different chord groups? And
I wouldn't get that far into it. I just say, okay, look, here's one lick that Muddy plays that I like, that you want to cop, that you want to learn. And then I might just take that lick in the key that it's in the song that I'm listening to, whatever it is, YouTube, CD, iTunes, whatever format you have it in. And you just concentrate on that lick in the key that Muddy's already playing it in, and you slow it down, you play it maybe 10 repetitions, you speed it up a little bit, you do it 10 more times, and you really get it under, however you want to put it, your fingers and your tongue and your brain, and you lock it in where you're really in control of it. Then I might think about transposing it to other keys. But I would try to really nail it in the one key first. Really, be able to play the idea and be in control of it technically, and feel like I could express it the way I wanted to, and then I would worry about moving it around.
Okay.
But I have students on both coasts right now who are doing things like this. Okay, I have one in Harlem in New York City who plays trumpet, and another one who plays tenor sax in Oregon, and teaching on the computer. And so I had a student who was learning all of their Dorian scales one week, which is a form of a minor scale, and then they were learning all their Mixolydian scales the next week. And actually, then after that, they're learning diminished scales. But eventually, I'll have them do blues scales and altered scales and the other modes and whole tone scales and all the different scales that we might use. You're not going to use a whole bunch of whole tone scales in the blues.
No.
I mean, so some of these are kind of more appropriate to different styles of music. But in jazz, there are probably 20 or 30 scales that we use all the time, and you kind of do need to learn them in all 12 keys. So, but that's how I do it with a student. I say, let's concentrate on one scale, one sound, and learn it in all 12. Instead of saying, I want you to learn 20 different scales in the key of C. So, one scale a week, but in all 12 keys, and then they come back and I say, let me hear it, but they have to have it memorized. They've got to be able to play it in any key comfortably. And when you get that together in a week, you feel very accomplished, because you can definitely do something you couldn't do 8 days ago. And then you have more, bag of tricks. You have more stuff that you can use when you're improvising.
The biggest complaint I have with learning scales is that I hear from students is it's boring, and just going from do
But that's
to
why
do.
that's why you limit it. You don't say, hey man, I want you to play 144 scales this week. You just focus it. You bite off a little chunk that you can chew. So again, if you say, I want you to learn all your minor scales this week, all 12, or I want you to learn your 12 Lydian modes or blues scales or whatever it is, if they just focus on one scale in 12 different keys, that's got enough technical challenges. That's enough for a week. So that's what I would do. I'd concentrate on one scale at a time, learn it in all 12.
Ever take a tune and just have them play the scale over, take a Dorian tune and play the Dorian
Well, sure.
scale over it, and it kind of makes practice a little more interesting, sounds more realistic.
Well, what you're talking about is, like, say you have a song like So What, Miles Davis, where the basic sounds and scales that we use on that tune are Dorian scales, which for those of you who don't know are minor scales with a raised sixth, okay? And if you're playing on So What, you're basically playing a D Dorian scale to improvise on the A section and an E flat Dorian scale on the bridge. So as a person trying to play a solo, So What's pretty simple, because if you know two scales, you can pretty much get through the tune. But they are a half step apart. You can't just stay in one key and hope to hang in there or fake it. So that would be a simple example of a tune where you're trying to apply that. But sure, I would have students do that.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, you don't want to get overly academic with it, but you do want them to be able to say, when I see a certain chord symbol, I know what scales might work well with it. And that's an example. If I see D minor 7, I might think D Dorian.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know if that's helpful to harmonica players as much.
I think it is. I think it is to a certain degree, because as harmonica players, you pick it up and blow, and that's how you learn, without putting much thought into it. But to get past that huff and puff stage, you have to put a little more thought into your practice, and that's what I'm trying to present here.
Speaking of which, have your students out here in cyberspace, have they heard Toots Thielmans? Because That's
Yeah.
the greatest jazz harmonica player who ever
Yeah.
lived, and he's just as fluent as a Charlie Parker or a Herbie Hancock, but on the harmonica.
I'm
so
sure
that's
a lot have. I'm sure
that's a
some
whole
have
other
it.
thing. And Toots
Yeah.
only passed away like about a year ago. He was like 91 years old. He lived out in the Hamptons,
Yeah.
off of Long Island, at the end of Long Island. But there's a guy who was as sophisticated a jazz improviser as we've ever had, and his instrument was the harmonica.
What's your, do you just put you on the spot? What's your favorite album that you know of that has Toots Thielemans on it?
There's a record by Bill Evans, the great jazz pianist, and it's called Affinity.
Yes.
And it's a non-traditional jazz quintet, because the front line normally would maybe be saxophone and trumpet in a quintet most often. And in this case, it's Larry Schneider on tenor sax and Toots on harmonica with piano, bass, and drums. So you got a quintet with the harmonica in the front line with saxophone. So that's a whole other idea, but the record's beautiful. It works.
That's my favorite Toots Thielemans record. So
Oh, okay.
like I
So,
said, that-
all right. So
out of all the
class
records-
over. Bye.
Yeah.
You know.
After all the records he did, that one was that's the one I would mention as well. 'Cause
Okay.
Affinity is just a fantastic record.